Ladies and gentlemen, hello again. Welcome to another Reflected Reality Simulations video. My name's Graham, this is X-Plane 11 and the FlightFactor A320. It's part 3 of the video series. In the first two videos we looked at the full cold and dark setup, taxi out, take off and climb, and then a procedural descent and approach into Lisbon on the ILS. In this video we're going to be looking at a few different things just to change the procedures around a little bit. On the approach into Lisbon, we left the aircraft fully managed to sort out its own vertical profile, and it activated the approach phase all by itself. We basically left the Airbus to do its thing. I mentioned at the time that's not really reflective of the vast majority of flights we do, where there's air traffic controllers and other aircraft in the sky. So we're going to start off by looking at some track shortening and how that can affect the vertical profile. We'll vector ourselves onto an ILS approach. We'll go around from minimums, pick up the hold, fly around the hold, and then reposition the aircraft to fly an ILS approach to an automatic landing. So quite a few things to cover in the video. We're going to land at Venice in Italy at the moment. We're just halfway between Croatia and Italy, running up the Adriatic. Pula airfield is just coming to view on the background there. Let's have a look at the charts to see if we can make sense of what we're going to do. So we're going to fly the Chioggia arrival. I do apologise to my Italian friends. I almost certainly am not pronouncing that correctly. I'll call it Chi from now on. We're approaching from the east-southeast towards Chi, and normally you'd route outbound here and in, and then Laren on towards Lattice. But that's very inefficient, and Venice isn't an overly busy airfield, so almost certainly air traffic would give you a nice vector kind of northwest here towards Lattice to pick up the ILS. So we'll look at how we can manage that track shortening first of all. Lattice is out here about 12 miles from the airfield, and if we look at the ILS approach chart, you can see that again Lattice is reflected here. We can see it on the profile view. But there's also a point 9.4 from the VTS, and that's the point we'll intercept the glide slope. VTS is the identifier for the ILS itself. So this video isn't really about briefing the approach or setting up the aircraft for the parameters you need. It's more about how to manage the flight profile to achieve what we need to do. The aircraft's paused at the moment. We're at 15,000 feet and just cruising along with the autopilot 1 in speed out, cruise and nav. So let's take the pause off. I'll bring up the nav display so we can see what we're looking at, and I'll click it into plan mode and zoom in. So if I go to Chi on the flight plan, we can see it taking us basically round the houses rather than going straight towards Lattice. The aircraft, if it was flying the profile, would have us at flight level 120 at Chi, and that's not going to be ideal at all. That would leave us very high if we lost all that track distance there. So what we can do is use the secondary flight plan. I'll click on secondary, make a copy of the active, and then rather than going to Chi to the X213 point here, we'll go from Chi to the point Lattice. And I'll just click it in on top of this X213. This limb is a pseudo waypoint. You should be able to insert Lattice over that, but the model at the moment it's not able to do that correctly. I will feed all that back to FlightFactor. As we look at the secondary plan, you can see it showing, if I just move it forward one waypoint, you can see it showing the shortcut here now. With that shortcut in mind, the aircraft would prefer to be over Chi at flight level 69. So whilst I'll leave the primary flight plan, the green one, loaded correctly, what I will do is rather than having it crossing Chi at flight level 120, I'll put in a flight level of 070. Now, before I insert that, let's go to the nav display again so you can see it. I'll put that constraint as 070, Chi. Watch the top of descent point now. So it moves the top of descent a lot closer to us. It's not changing the lateral profile, it's not going to change what's downlinked on the Mode S transponder information. It's simply allowing the aircraft to fly a more conservative profile. With that in mind, top of descent is just a couple of minutes away. I'll get rid of the pop-up window just now, and what we'll do is, rather than worry about the vertical profile, we'll simply focus on the horizontal elements. So I'll descend down to an altitude of 3,000 feet using descent mode. That's speed descent. Alt blue 3,000. The little ECAM notice has come up here. It says outer tank fuel transferred. If you look on the fuel page, A320's got outer cells and inner cells. And once it gets down to a set level, it transfers the fuel from the outers to the inners. That's the same with the 319, and the 321 has got one continuous fuel tank. You'll see that quite often, once you get to about 3 tons. I think it's about 750 odd kilos, it would usually start the transfer at. So tracking down towards CHI, remember it's in descent mode, it's doing 1,000 feet a minute until it intercepts the profile, and then it'll fly down an idle descent. At the moment we'd be landing in Venice at 2.4 tons. We've used the secondary for one function already, and that's looking at the shortening. We can also use it as a basis for fuel calculations for an alternate airfield as well. If I copy the active again, and then click lateral revision on CHI, and tell it that rather than going to Venice, we'll go to Venice Treviso, I believe it's pronounced. Lima India Papa Hotel. We'll load the arrival. I want to do an ILS onto runway 07, and there's a CHI transition as well. And then what we'll do is just clear out everything down to present position, down towards CHI. We can see that on the display as well. Let me get rid of that. So going to CHI, down to the other airfield, the other airfield, it says we'd we'd land with 2.4 tons as well. If I was going to divert there, it's unlikely I'd fly a full arrival, so I'll take CHI out and we'll leave it with volette, which is basically an extended centerline. That'll become relevant once we're in the missed approach procedure. So just watching what the aircraft's doing, it's about to intercept the vertical profile and start descending a little bit quicker towards CHI. See, it's got thrust idle. I've got it descending at 300 knots just to make the video a little bit shorter. You'd normally expect around 280 knots in the descent. So X-Plane doesn't model DMEs from ILS sites very well. The DME reception isn't really as directional as the glide slope of the localizer. You can receive it quite far out. In this case, X-Plane's not showing it at all, and it's basically all aircraft in X-Plane seem to have that deficiency. But one thing we can do on the Airbus, if we go into the prog page here, I can put Lima India Papa Zulu runway 04 right, and it will give me a bearing and a distance. It says it's 35 miles to the threshold. So even direct line to the threshold, 35 miles, we know from our 3 times table we're roughly where we need to be if we take that shortcut. So in a minute or two the aircraft's going to slow down all by itself to 250 knots to try and make the 10,000 feet 250 knots limit. There we go, targeting 250 knots. So until air traffic actually put us on a vector, we'll leave the flight plan exactly as we had loaded previously. If we'd been cleared for the arrival, we can see on the arrival chart that we could fly outbound and then basically all the way as far as Lattice and then even Venezia here to hold. But that's not going to be an issue today. Coming back through flight level 100, speed's coming back to 250 knots. I'll put the landing lights on and the seat belts on. That seems like a good opportunity for the Venice controllers to give us a radar heading. So let's say they give us a heading onto 320 degrees. Watch what happens with my thrust idle descent mode as I pull this. So there's heading, it goes into speed VS minus 800. The reason being, now that I'm off the track, I can't fly descent modes. It doesn't know what profile I want to fly. So I've got open descent available or vertical speed. I'll go thrust idle, open descent. Now it would be good to have some better information from the aircraft, some more useful information available on the screen. This green arc here, that's the minimum distance to the runway. It's not very useful in the real thing. We don't use that very much. What we do use is the distance to threshold, the progress page on the FMGC, and there's another little trick we can do. You see, I've got to make sure the waypoints sequence correctly, otherwise it won't be able to fly the missed approach. At the moment it's got CHI on here, and it may sequence, it may go close enough to sequence to the X213, but it certainly won't go close enough to that to sequence onto Agave. So what we've got to do is extend the center line. I'll go direct, and remember VTS 94, that's the point we're going to pick up the glide slope, but rather than doing direct to insert, I'll click radial in 219. That's the reciprocal of the runway heading, so it's 040 and 220. It's 1 degree out in X-plane. Now watch what happens when I click insert. It draws me a green line there, but then we've got nav blue, and it's going to fly its own intercept on there in nav. Now we could leave it doing that, but that wouldn't really comply with air traffic clearance. Air traffic will have told us to fly heading 320. If we turn on to fly an ILS without further clearance, that'd be a mistake. So I'm just going to pull heading again, get rid of the blue nav, and you see my center line there. It has the effect of giving me a distance to VTS, that's 19 miles. There's also a cross-track distance, that's distance from the localizer center line. I want to be 3,000 feet at VTS 94. I'm just approaching 7,000 feet. That gives me 4,000 feet to lose. I would need 12 miles, and I've also got some speed to lose as well. So what I'm going to do is just deploy a little bit of speed brake and get slightly underneath the profile. Notice also that there's no decel point. We haven't passed a decel point on the flight plan, and if we do intercept a VTS, we'll miss the decel flight point. What that means is the aircraft won't go into approach phase by itself. So instead I'm going to pull speed, set 250, and then in here, perf, activate approach, confirm activate approach. If I manage the speed now, it'll come back to the VAP speed. That's why I selected it initially. I didn't want it to come back to the final approach speed straight away. I want to keep flying at 250 knots. I've now got 3,000 feet to lose and 14 miles to do it. I'd need 9 miles, so the speed brake's helping out. A good rule of thumb is with 10 miles to go, I need to lose 2,000 feet and about 1/3 of the ground speed for the sink rate. So around about what, 8, 16, 24, 900 feet per minute for 270 knots. That's just to let us slow down. I'll just keep coming under the profile ever so slightly. That looks reasonable there. So I'll put those speed brakes away. And what I want to do is start slowing down. So I'm going to do this a slightly different way. I'm going to manage the speed. It's going to bring the nose up to target green dot. But as it gets to around 900 feet per minute, I'm going to reselect VS. I've got speed VS, and the aircraft will gradually bleed the speed back. You can check on the progress page here. It thinks we're a little bit high. 16 miles to the airfield. I would need 12 miles plus a little bit to slow down. So it's very close to where we need to be. The Airbus is a very slippery aircraft on the final approach. I mentioned on the video for Lisbon that although Airbus say it will do flap 1 down the slope, almost everybody uses flap 2 unless there's a really strong headwind, because it's too slippery. It won't maintain the speeds that it's really expected to maintain. So less than 1,000 feet to go. That's looking perfect. I'll just back the vertical speed off now. Down to about 400 feet per minute should work. I can take a final heading in just a few seconds. See, we've got the DME now from VTS. So let's come left onto, let's try 360. That's maybe a bit tight. We're inside the flap extension speed for config 1, so I'll select flap 1 and it'll come back to target S speed. That looks like a good intercept vector. On there, I'll arm the approach mode, second autopilot, so I've got Cat 3 dual, AP 1 and 2, with glide slope blue and lock blue. 3 miles to the intercept, 300 feet to go. There we go. So we've got to the point where we're underneath the profile. We're slowing down. I want to be well under 200 knots when we pick up the glide slope. We've got the localizer armed and the glide slope armed. We try and not fly level for too long on the final approaches, but sometimes it's unavoidable. To do a continuous descent approach, you've really got to know the track distances you've got. There's lock star, still descending. It's about to capture either alt or glide slope, it'll be very close. There's glide slope star, flap 2, and 3000 is set for the missed approach altitude. It's just turning on to the final approach now. So as I mentioned, the real aircraft's quite slippery. We can see if we look outside that in config 2, we've not got very much flap out at all. There's the leading edge slats and a little bit of flap on the trailing edge. Config 1 is only slats on the Airbus. When you're on the ground, you get 1 plus F, which is slats and flaps. But airborne, config 1 is slats only. There's not so much drag. What we want to do is just monitor the deceleration coming down here. I've got a bottom line at a flat airfield of about 4.5 miles, 160 knots, 5.5, 170, and 6.5, 180. So we're easily within those speed limits at the moment, or those gates if you like. 160, 4.5, 170, 5.5. Well, we're less than 170 outside 5.5. What that means is I'm quite happy to just hold it at 160 for a few seconds, just so we don't slow down far too early. On the approach with 2.6 tons of fuel. So we're selected speed now, 160, and then we'll remanage the speed when we get to 5 miles. There we go, 5 miles. Speed's managed. Gear down, flap 3, check we're still within the flap limiting speed, and flap full. Do the pilot monitoring actions as well. And then we've got the landing memo. There's no blue on there, we've got auto brake selected. The missed approach is sequenced. There's the marker beacon. So just approaching 1000 radial, engines are spooling up, we're on the glide slope, on the localizer, it's all looking stable. So I mentioned we're going to fly the missed approach from this and we'll take it out towards the hold. The missed approach is really quite straightforward on the Airbus, especially when it's auto coupled. We're simply going to push the thrust levers towards TOGA and say go around flaps. The pilot monitoring is going to retract the flaps one stage, so we'll go from full to flap 3. We'll read the FMAs, put the gear up, check the FMAs and make sure that we're in nav mode again. The secret to a good missed approach is there's no need to rush it, even if you're going around from Cat 1 minimums, 210 in this case.
Approaching 04
There's
right.
plenty of time to do it.
$500. 400. 500 above. 300. Minimum.
Go around flaps. Flap 3. Man TOGA, SRS, nav. We get positive climb. Gear up. Climb blue, 3000. It's in nav just now. If we need it to go into nav, we push for nav. And that's it, climbing away on the missed approach. We're going to bring the thrust back around 1500 and then level at 3000. So it flashes lever climb. There's the second click, speed, alt star with auto thrust. Above F speed, so above F speed we'll select flap 1. Just check it's reducing the pitch to capture the alt as it should be. And then above S speed, we'll select flap 0. Once the flaps are away, I'll just bring that up to keep an eye on it. Once the flaps are away, we'll stow the speed brake again and turn off the lights that are on the nose leg. There you go, capture the altitude. I'll start the timer running and we've got 2.4 tons in the tanks. That'd be a very common arrival fuel. It'd be quite common to land with about 2.5 tons when the alternate airfield is quite nearby. So it's not a lot of fuel, but it does give us a little bit of time to sort this out. Just double check the aircraft's in the state it should be. We've got the speed brakes disarmed, we're clean at the moment. We talked about flying the hold at clean speed rather than 185, so we don't need extra drag out on the aircraft, extra flaps out. And there we go. So the missed approach, especially an automatic missed approach on the Airbus, is really straightforward. Just to go through it one more time, we push the thrust levers through to TOGA and we say go around flaps. The pilot monitoring retracts the flaps one stage, so from flap full to flap 3. We read the FMAs, so that's the green FMAs, man TOGA, SRS. Sometimes it says go around track, sometimes it says nav. It depends on the mod state the aircraft's in and how the nav database is coded. Once we've read the FMAs, the pilot monitoring looks for and calls positive climb or positive rate. We put the gear up and then manage nav if we need to, and then read the blue FMAs to make sure it's going to capture. So flying out towards the hold now, 12 TES and then inbound, and 9 TES is the actual fix itself. So this is the hold entry and then the hold itself. The way it's defined at Venice is a little bit unusual, but 12 TES is a fix on the missed approach, and then we're going to turn around and do a direct entry onto the hold at 9 TES. Notice the aircraft is stuck at green dot speed despite the fact it's in managed speed. Once it's in the go around phase, it targets green dot rather than 250 knots. It also resequences the approach we've just flown, so it's got lattice back again. It says it's deleted the constraints up until the final approach point. But we've got lattice, VTS 94, the marker and the runway. So that's dead straightforward. Looking at the perf page though, we're in the go around phase rather than the descent phase, and I've got a next phase available now. It's another approach phase. Rather than activating it just now, I'm just simply going to make the change that rather than using a minima of 210, I'm going to say we're doing a Cat 3B arrival with no decision height, so no for the DH. We need to be thinking about the fuel as well. We need to land with at least half an hour of fuel in the aircraft. That's our final reserves. On the A320, that's typically around about 1.1 to 1.2 tons. Final reserves is defined as 1500 feet above the airfield at your clean speed in the hold for half an hour, or words to that effect. The simple way to consider it here is the fuel flow on each engine is just under 1 ton per hour. So 2 engines, 2 tons per hour, half an hour is the same as what you see for 1 engine. So we need roughly 1 ton as our final reserve. Obviously we're a little bit higher, so the fuel burn's a little bit less, but let's use 1 ton as what we need. The aircraft itself, with that approach reloaded, it thinks we'd land the EFOB with 1.9 tons. That's still okay. That gives us enough to make the approach and land with at least 800 kilos, 900 kilos over final reserves. But do we still have the ability to divert? Let's look on the secondary flight plan. It's got PPOS to volet there. If I put this into plan mode, we should be able to see that it simply has the volet. So it's going from where we are now to volet to hold. It thinks 0.8 at the moment, so it's probably a little bit on the tight side. We could still land safely, but we'd do that on a mayday because we'd be landing with less than reserve fuel in the tanks. This figure will change though. I don't think it'll ever be as bad as 0.8. We'll review that as we go. What we're considering is why we went around, whether or not it was an airfield issue or air traffic issue or something we did with the aircraft itself that caused us to go around. Whether or not we'd be happy to hold here waiting for Venice to allow us to make another approach, or whether we'd have diverted straight away from flying the missed approach procedure. You'll usually have about a minimum of 5 minutes to make that decision. We ran the timer and it's about 4 minutes since we flew the missed approach. So what I'm going to do is just let it enter the hold, and then we'll peel off the hold and fly back for another attempt at the landing. The way this is coded on the FMGC here, we've got 9 TES as the hold fix, the hold, and then a discontinuity. That's quite common. If we'd loaded the arrival via lattice, via the 12 TES in fact, we'd be able to fly a DME arc. You can see it on the ILS chart here. See there's an arc from 12 out of 14 DME arc, then round towards lattice. We could load that, but I'll simply revector the aircraft downwind instead. That's a little bit quicker to do. One of the interesting things about the Airbus is once you're in heading mode and you've started the turn, it won't reverse the turn direction once you spin it round beyond 180 degrees. On some aircraft you've got to be careful that you don't move the heading bug further round in the tail of the aircraft, otherwise bad stuff happens, it will reverse the turn. So you see we've got immediate exit available for the hold now, but that won't actually do anything because there's nothing after the hold, so let's not worry about that. What we'll do instead is we'll take a heading of 270, but we'll go all the way around to hold. So I'll spin it initially to the right, pull heading, goes into heading mode, and then keep turning all the way around onto 270. It's a lot of mouse wheel action here. Notice the aircraft doesn't reverse the turn, despite the fact if we look on the nav display, it's over here we're going. And that's true to life in the Airbus. So 6 minutes from the missed approach. We had 2.4 and now we've got 2.2. So we've used 200 kilos in 6 minutes. That's 2 tons in an hour. So that kind of cross-checks the fuel that we're burning. On the aircraft with the more modern displays, if we bring up the fuel page, you can see it's got the actual fuel flow in kilograms per minute as well, which is quite useful. See the outer tanks have completely emptied now. Only the left main and right main tanks. So with all the fuel that we've got on the aircraft, all this fuel here is usable to us, which is a good thing. Another interesting thing, if you're keen on self-vectoring yourself, you can actually bring up the second display at the same time as the first display, and then maybe put that one into plan mode. If it helps you build situational awareness, then I'm all for that. Use the second display for that. So what we've got to be careful of here is the point we activate the approach again, and how we extend the centre line. The reason being is we're on the holding fix at the moment. If I was to extend the centre line, it would go into nav mode. I've never actually tried that on the real aircraft because usually it's just easier to take radar vectors and worry about the next part further down. I don't know if that's exactly how the aircraft's supposed to behave, but it's certainly how the sim behaves. We'll make our life nice and easy by not worrying about it. The trap here is forgetting which phase we're in. So although we're at green dot, notice the speed target is also green dot, the magenta arrow here. That's a good indication that we're running in the go around phase. So if I bring up the PFD, go into perf, activate approach, watch the speed target here. It comes down to 133, which is the VAP. And that's calculated automatically by the aircraft. You don't need to worry about that. It measures the VLS and the VAP, and it's aware of the weights. So you never have to update that on the real thing. It will do it by itself. So now we're heading off the hold. It's a sensible time to extend the sound line again, just like we did before. Direct, VTS 94. And rather than flying out there and turning, we're going to use radial in, 219, and direct insert. See, it goes back into nav and fails into heading. Again, as I said, I think that's a sim specific at the moment. I'll not worry about that. The most useful thing we've got now, I mentioned it previously, is the cross-track distance. Roughly 200 knots, we'll need about 3.5 miles to complete a 180-degree turn. So what I'm going to do is try and fly downwind between 4 and 3.5 miles cross-track. And this is where the cross-track indicator is really useful. Probably a fairly unrealistic vector in real life. I think they probably wouldn't fly us over the central Venice area here, but what the hey. You can't have fun in the sim, what's the point? 4.5 miles, I'll start turning on to 220 initially. We'll refine that as we get a bit closer. So remember, I want to be 3.5 miles minimum cross track. Looking okay. I'm flying with nil wind on at the moment. There's very little wind around, but you know, on the Airbus you can click this button here and you'll get track rather than heading. It changes the flight directors as well, so it uses the flight path vector. These flight directors are less intuitive to use, I find, but if you need to absolutely fly a track, then you've got that capability there. We'll go back to heading. So let's have a look at how that secondary fuel situation is going. The aircraft thinks we'll land at the destination airport with 1.9 tonnes on board. Back to the secondary, and from the present position to Volet, and then all the way down to Treviso, 1.1 tonnes. That's landing with more than final reserves. It would be quite tight, but we could still do it from here. If we ended up flying a missed approach and then onto the alternate airfield, that would almost certainly be either a minimum fuel or a mayday call, depending on how tight it was. One go around you can almost always manage with the fuel that you've got left without any real issues. A second go around is when it gets really interesting. We try and avoid that. So tracking nicely, 3.5 cross track. BTS 94 is the point we want to be at 3,000 feet. We're at 3,000 feet, we've got the approach phase active, and we're in a clean config. Still got the seatbelt signs on, and all the fuel we have in the tanks is usable. Still got 2 tonnes. As we pass VTS 94, I could either spin the heading around and re-intercept, or I could use the direct to function and watch it fly onto it itself. We intercepted on the heading the previous time, so this time we'll just use the direct to. About 12 minutes since we flew the missed approach, and depending on the airfield, anything between 10 and 20 minutes would be normal from a go around to another landing. So just crossing the VTS 94 point here. If I was to put direct VTS 94, you see it draws a yellow line, intercept, and then round we go. It's now in nav to the VTS 94. We don't need to worry about extending the centerline now because the waypoint here, we're going to fly over it. We will always sequence correctly. And that's what the extended centerline is all about. It's making sure the waypoint here, the next waypoint, is going to sequence correctly so you can use nav for the missed approach. If you don't have that, it gets really messy. So I'm already at 200 knots. I want to be less than 200 knots, preferably 180 with flap 2 at the glide slope. Coming around the corner, it's still in nav, so we don't want that. We want to put the approach mode in with AP1 and 2. Again, Cat 3 dual, AP1 and 2, we've got glide slope blue and log blue. Two and a half miles from the VTS 94, we'll select flap 1. It comes back to S speed, that's the lowest speed it can fly in this config. And note, it's only got the slats out, as I mentioned before. That's why when you look on the outside, you see the pitch angle, the pitch attitude is quite high. Approaching the glide slope. About a mile before the VTS 94, take flap 2. There's lock star, glide star, mission approach altitude is 3000. And again, we'll just monitor that deceleration. Remember, 160, 170, 180 knots. No closer than 4.5, 5.5 and 6.5 miles. At this point, we're well under all those speeds, so I'll reselect 160 and just fly that for a while. You can use the speed brake on the 319 and 320. You can use the speed brake with gear and flap 3. You can't use it with flap full. On a 321, you can't use speed brake with flap 3 either. But the speed brake's not terribly effective at low speed. Trying to decel down an approach with flap 1 and the speed brake is just a recipe for it not working. You'd almost certainly use the gear. The gear is about the most effective drag you've got on the aircraft. So on the previous approach, I took it down to 5 miles at 160 knots. What I'll do is, just to top up the automatic landing, I'll manage the speed, put the gear down, pilot monitoring would arm the spoilers, turn the nose lag lights on, check the speed, take flap 3, and flap full. Excellent. So we've got the landing memo, no blue, and we've got auto brake. So for the automatic landing, it's again on the Airbus, it's always about monitoring the FMAs. We're looking for the aircraft to go into the land mode. You'll see land on both the center columns here. It should have done that by the time we get to 350 radial, and it should be in a flare mode by the time it gets to 30 radial. If it's not in either of those, we're going to go around straight away. If we get any cautions from the aircraft, any ECAMs or any misbehavior on the autopilot, we're going to go around again. So doing an automatic landing in low-vis conditions, we'd have a lot more fuel than this 1.9 tons we've got just now. This is where the thrust currently is, and this little donut indicates where the thrust levers are. Because it's an automatic landing, it's going to initiate thrust idle and bring the power back. But the thrust levers are still going to be in the detent because these aren't powered. I've got control of these. That's why the aircraft calls retard. That's a reminder to bring the power back out of the gate. We got the gear down, everything's sensible, landing config and stable for the approach. So the Airbus is pretty unusual in that you've got to always take action on the thrust levers. I think I mentioned that on the first video as well, that on a Boeing, when the thrust levers are powered, the auto thrust will do its thing on there, whereas you don't have that same feedback on the Airbus.
Right.
Once the aircraft's on the ground, we're going to select reverse thrust. The spoilers will deploy automatically. We're looking for spoilers here, reverse green here, and a decel trend on the PFD. There's the land mode.
300.
And making sure it says flare before 30 feet. If it's not in flare at 30 radial, we go around.
200. 100. 50. 40.
It's
30,
flare.
20.
Thrust idle.
10. Retard. Retard. 5.
Spoilers, reversers, go. Red, green, and the decel trend. Autopilot's still in. It's tracking the centre line. Auto brake's working. We've got to remember to take the autopilot out, otherwise it won't be very happy turning off the runway. So, autopilot's out. Auto brakes are off. And speed's coming down. Forward idle. Just tap the brakes a little bit and we'll vacate the runway. There's another X-plane signature distance marker in the middle of the taxiway. Gotta love that. So the sim does a very nice job of the automatic landing, especially in nil wind conditions like this. The real aircraft can be quite variable. Every Autoland we do, we've got to provide a report on how the aircraft performed. The majority of the times it's quite acceptable.
Approaching 2.
One or two occasions
right.
it's given me a rather firm arrival, which is not what you want. So vacating runway. What we'll do is stop it here.
On runway 2 right.
And then we'll do some of the actions just to consolidate those as well. Set the parking brake. As we exit the runway, the pilot monitoring would have switched off the landing lights and the strobe lights. Once we received the taxi instructions, pilot flying would stow the spoilers. Notice that the spoilers didn't move back. It's simply an arming lever. You indicate the spoilers on the system display there. On the overhead, start the APU. Switch off the landing system. Come down here, turn off the weather radar, not yet functional in the model. Retract the flaps to 0. And we turn off the TCAS system as well. So TCAS to standby, leaving transponder in auto. And that's it. A radar vectored approach, down towards minimums, flying the missed approach, entering the hold for a moment before vectored off downwind and coming back for an automatic landing. If we look at the map, we can see that we did the turn, exiting the hold. We kind of tracked more or less inbound on exactly the same track as we'd done previously. Remember the spacing for that to work nicely, 3.5 miles at green dot speed. If you're a little bit tighter in, then you can just slow it down, flap 1 or flap 2. We'll talk about that as we do a visual approach in a later video. But for green dot speed, 3.5 miles cross track. We remember to extend the centre line on the VTS 94 so the FMGC knew which waypoints were ahead. We're on the ground here, 1.8 tons. We flew the missed approach at 2.4 tons, so we've used 600 kilograms from the missed approach to we're on the ground. It took about 20 minutes or so. So even if we went around from the second approach and went all the way out to the hold rather than coming straight downwind, we'd still have landed off the third approach with 1.2 tons. Admittedly, that's a little bit on the uncomfortable side, a little bit tight. But, you know, it's acceptable. Remember your final reserves, 30 minutes flying time. So around about 1.2 tons is a sensible final reserves to use. I hope you found the video enjoyable. I hope you learned something new about the Airbus in the video. In the next video we're going to look at perhaps a non-precision approach, maybe an RNAV or a VOR overlay approach. Then moving on from that, we'll have a look at visual procedures or circling procedures, and from then on it's up to you. Let me know in the comments what you'd like to see done with the Airbus and what sort of procedures you're interested in learning with it. It's a very capable model in the sim. There's a few little bits and pieces on the FMGC that are still being worked out, and some of the systems are still being worked on as well. But the level it's at as of this point is good enough to fly the majority of things you do with the real aircraft on a day-to-day basis. As always, thanks very much for listening to me for so long, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you.